Welcome, my name is Michael Anderson. Today I will be talking about the equipment that was issued to the Mormon Battalion once they arrived at Fort Leavenworth. We'll first start with the leather accoutrements. As you can see, I have the leather accoutrements on that would have been issued. Many battalion members in their journals mentioned that the accoutrements that they received included a cartridge box that was carried on the right side. In fact, Zadok Judd even described how the 2 1/4 white cartridge box sling was slung over the left shoulder, which allowed the cartridge box to be on the right side. He also mentioned that the scabbard, the bayonet scabbard sling, was slung over the right shoulder, which would have placed the scabbard that held the bayonet on the left side. And these were pulled together by a white belt. Here's an example of that belt they would have used, made of buff leather, had a small oval US brass belt plate attached to it. And this belt would actually hold the cartridge box and the bayonet scabbard belt, shoulder belt, to the side. As far as cartridge boxes, the types and models of cartridge boxes and bayonet scabbards and belts, it's a little bit unclear. We know through government records that companies A and D were given the 1839 pattern cartridge box. As far as the other 3 companies, those records have not been located, and so we're not 100% sure. We believe, based on descriptions given by battalion members, that there may have been 2 different varieties available. The 1839 pattern was the most current pattern designed for the infantry troops, but some of them may have been issued some older, what they call 1828. As far as the cartridge box goes, here's an example of the model 1828 cartridge box. It was actually designed after the model 1808 cartridge box used during the War of 1812, other than it had a really beautiful embossed eagle onto the leather there. The main difference between this one and the 1839 was on the inside. The inside had a wooden block in the top where the cartridges were held, and it had a compartment down below where you could access the flints and other things that were used, musket tools that were used on the musket. Now in 1839, they redesigned the box. It still had a similar outside flat pattern, but instead of the embossed eagle, they went with the brass oval US plate, and it's because of this plate mentioned in the records of Company A and Company D that we know that the 1839 cartridge box was being used. On the inside, it was considerably different in that it had tins on the inside that would hold the cartridges. So you had 2 of these tins. You'd have each tin would hold a package of cartridges in the bottom, and they would hold 10 each cartridges in the top. It also had an implement pouch here where the musket tools, extra flints, and flint wraps could be carried. Both cartridge boxes were carried over the shoulder with a buff leather strap. Now the baldric, or the bayonet scabbard belt, once again there's 2 patterns that could have been used. The 1820, they actually differ very little, and they both had buff leather straps. They had a scabbard, and really the primary difference between the 2 was the scabbard and how the scabbard fit into the leather frog, and there was a little bit difference in the stitching. You can see the frog attachment here is kind of squared off and stitched onto the belt. It has a button stud that holds the scabbard into place in the frog portion of the baldric. For the 39 pattern, really the only difference is how the scabbard fits into the frog. It actually has the hook on the back side So you can see it comes through the back holding it on, and generally speaking the frog is oval shaped, how the frog is attached to the belt itself. In both cases, usually they would carry their pick and brush attachment on this belt so that when they were in need of the pick and brush to take care of their musket, it was readily available. The next items of equipment to be discussed would be the haversack and the water bottle or canteen. The haversack was an item that was issued to the soldiers as a means to carry their rations as well as their individual mess gear. The haversack being manufactured and issued to regular troops at the time was a simple cotton drill bag with a scallop pattern to the flap. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that all volunteers were given this haversack. Once again, the arsenals, the quartermaster was unable to produce all the materials they needed to issue to the volunteers, and so sometimes private contractors were allowed to produce versions of this type of a haversack. I've actually seen an example that looks similar, although it had a rectangular flap closure, but it was probably a cotton duct canvas material as opposed to the cotton drill that this one's made out of. Okay, both the haversack and the canteen were carried on the left side of the volunteer's body. So they slung over the right shoulder and came off on the left side, as you can see here. The canteen would sit on top of the haversack, and both items were readily available along the trail if they needed a drink of water or if they needed to get some food out of their haversack. Inside the haversack, as I mentioned, were carried rations as well as mess gear. Generally they would have some type of a plate. Here's kind of a flat tin one. Here's a tin plate kind of in a bowl shape. I prefer this one. It kind of holds the food. Either item could be used to even cook food if they had to. As far as utensils went, they would privately purchase all these items. They would carry their fork, their knife, and their spoon. And we'll do a little close-up of these items here in just a minute. A lot of times they would have a handkerchief and little poke bags or ration bags where this one's got some coffee beans in it, and this one's got some broken up crackers that are left over, hard bread in other words, that I could eat along the trail. Tied to the strap of the haversack or placed inside the haversack would be a tin cup. They would have some form of a string if they wished to tie it onto the sling. Otherwise they would just place the tin cup inside their haversack. Here's a close-up view of the haversack and the haversack contents. You can see on the right a haversack that's in its closed position, and the haversack on the left, which has some of its contents minus most of the rations laid outside. A couple of ration bags where they would put some extra food that they could eat along the march. You can see the broken up crackers, hard bread there inside the plate, hand towel, fork, knife, and spoon. Sometimes they would actually carry their fire making materials inside the haversack as well, but they would not carry personal items. The food bag or the haversack, also called a bread bag, often got very dirty. So they pretty much kept the bag for use with food, rations, as well as their mess gear, and pretty much limit it to that. As far as canteens go, the issue canteen during the time period, the one being produced by the quartermaster department, was one of two versions of this particular canteen. This is round, but it has a kind of a gusset that goes all the way around and had a stamped US in a circle. This particular one is a 1-quart size. There was also a 2-quart size. The problem with tin canteens is they could be noisy, clanging around, but even more so of a problem was the fact that they absorbed the heat of the sun. So if you found a nice cool pond in the morning and filled your canteen up, by afternoon when that sun hit 100 degrees, your water could be 110 degrees. So that was somewhat problematic with a tin canteen. The other type of canteen that was often being issued were wood drum style canteens, and they kind of made like a barrel. You had the staves, usually you had either a leather sling or a heavy linen type sling. You notice that the government issue one, they pretty much always had leather slings. Now the drum style canteens, they either had metal bands to hold them in place, or they would have wood interlocking bands to hold them in place. The problem with wood is if they dried out or allowed to dry out, they would tend to split and crack and open up, and then they would not hold water. And this became a problem with the battalion because there are occasions when they went a couple of days without any water. Also, if these were dropped, they would split or crack, rendering them useless. As they arrived in the South, they found canteens being made out of an item from the squash family. We call today a gourd. And gourds usually had a large bottom. They would have a neck, a smaller top, and with the neck that would allow them to secure the canteen with a leather sling or one made of rope. These were made simply by removing the top, working out once they were dried, you'd work out the seeds and whatever else was on the inside, then you would line them with beeswax. Make a cork, and they were ready to be used. The nice thing about these is they would keep the water cool. They had a tendency of an evaporation process going on, which would keep the water cool throughout the day. And they were quite durable. In fact, this one here is well over a 1/4 inch thick. So these were a really good item, and there were mentions in different journals of soldiers during the Mexican War getting rid of their tin canteens and replacing them with a canteen made out of a gourd. The final piece of equipment that I would like to discuss today is the knapsack or blanket bag. The purpose of the knapsack was to carry the soldier or volunteers' bedding and extra clothing and personal equipment. As many of the equipment items were not exactly sure which knapsack was used by the Mormon Battalion. Just before the war broke out, the Model 1825 knapsack was the knapsack that was being used and produced by the U.S. government for the soldiers. It's referred to as a soft pack, very simply constructed. It's made of a canvas and then painted or tarred to give it some waterproofing abilities. This way it can keep the bedding and whatever the contents are dry and protected from the weather on a march. These knapsacks, when there's nothing inside, will open up and look like this. The top portion here, this large rectangle, is where the blanket was actually folded and then wrapped into place, and then the bottom compartment is where the remaining clothing items and personal gear would be located, and then the top part would be wrapped around and strapped into place. And we'll demonstrate how that's done here shortly. First, let's show how the knapsack was used. So you have two shoulder straps, and within the shoulder straps there's a cross strap that goes across the chest, and that helps pull the straps in and makes the knapsack a little bit more comfortable to carry. So I sling one of the straps over my left shoulder, then I place my right arm in the other shoulder, take the cross strap, get it nice and snug, put it into place, and I'm ready for my march. So the 1825 soft pack knapsack was the one being issued to the soldiers prior to the Mexican War. As the war broke out, it's unclear if all the soldiers was getting this particular model. It was impossible for the U.S. government to supply all the troops, so contractors and other sources were utilized to procure a lot of the equipment that was being given or issued to the volunteers. Another type of knapsack that was being used during that time period would have been the hard pack, which was made of leather. I have found that the leather knapsacks don't hold near as much gear. Either style of knapsack, you can place most of your gear on the inside. However, if you had two blankets, you would be required to put that second blanket on top. But keep in mind, anything you put on top or on the outside of the knapsack would not be protected by the oilcloth canvas that made up the knapsack. But once again, leather knapsacks, referred to as hard packs, could have been used. However, there is some evidence that maybe we can discuss later that indicates that maybe the Mormon Battalion had the soft pack.